Okay. Good evening, guys. Thank you very much for joining to SGAC Zimbabwe webinar, where we're going to be discussing about industrial capability, Africa's industrial capabilities in the global space ecosystem. And my name is Muongeni Tamara Manda, and I'm the national point of contact for SGAC here in Zimbabwe. I'm also a researcher and then a space analyst. So today we are joined by three distinct speakers from North, West, and Southern Africa. We are going to be discussing with us the role of Africa in the space ecosystem. And in this webinar, Mr. Thando Mathe is going to be the moderator of this webinar. Our speakers, we have Ms. Nyango from RIIS, the Research Institute for Innovation and Sustainability. We also have Ms. Mustafa, who is from Space in Africa, and Mr. Salah from Algeria. So these guests are going to highlight the pathways to scale up manufacturing, investment, and youth-driven innovation, where we are going to be discussing highlighting the problems that we are facing in Africa to compete in the global space ecosystem. Is it the problem with the launching system? Is it the government? Is it the policy? Or is it the funding, or we lack innovation? So in all this is going to be discussed today, and we hope we have an amazing session today. So without wasting much of your time, let me hand over to our guests so that they introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their background and the current state of space economy in relation to their work. So we'll start by Ms. Nyango, then we'll pass on to Ms. Mustafa, and then lastly, Ms. Salah. So over to you, Ms. Nyango. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Just get an indication that everyone can hear me clearly. So just a thumbs up or something, Muongeni, on your end, if everyone can hear me clearly. Great, thank you, Thando. Cool. Firstly, I think thanks to you yourself, Muongeni, for extending the invite, and I'd like to thank everyone as well for attending this session. It's a privilege for myself to be part of this conversation, speaking about the space sector in Africa, but also the world and how Africa is playing against the world as well. My name is Yanko Likaku, as Muongeni has mentioned. I'm an engagement manager at RIIS. We're an innovation consulting firm that deals in different sectors. And one of those happens to be space. So a lot of the work that we do as consultants and innovation consultants is we're looking at best practices and best ways to ensure that operations and companies are working at the best way possible. So what we do is bring this a lot to the space sector. And not only the space sector, but ensuring that we're building innovative ecosystems around startups and entrepreneurs, and we've got different mechanisms for doing that. But we're looking at how best the innovation network around the space sector is, and how it's empowering the locals to participate as well. Also understanding that space sector to a large extent is meeting a lot of national priority needs in Africa. This is something that we're really looking at how best we can empower startups, entrepreneurs, businesses to ensure that they participate and work in that. So that's me in a nutshell. And that's how my work relates to the space sector. And I'm looking forward to the engaging conversation, looking at private sector, looking at the youth participation in space, and also engaging with everyone on the call. So thank you so much. Mustafa, I think I'm supposed to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. So let me just steal from your notebook. Can everyone hear me clearly? Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. First off, I'd like to say a very big thank you to the organizers, for bringing me to this insightful program. My name is Mustafa Derawumi. I'm a senior analyst at Space in Africa, and basically what we do at Space in Africa is space business consulting, market analysis, market research, basically trying to help all the players, from the government and also like the private sector players to navigate the entire ecosystem with little or no force. So that is what I do, and that is how it relates to the space ecosystem. And I look forward to the engaging conversation with them. Salah.
Thank you, good afternoon, and thank you, Muongeni and Thando from SGAC Zimbabwe for the kind invitation and for spotlighting such an important topic. It's truly an honor to be part of this conversation on the state of Africa's space industry, and I'm especially pleased to share this panel with Mustafa and Yanko, and I look forward to contributing to a rich and engaging discussion. My name is Salahuddin Bantata. I'm based in the city of Oran in Algeria. I am the founder of C-Space Consulting, a consultancy startup providing system engineering and space project development services. And I am also an expert at the Algerian Space Agency, where I served in developing the local space ecosystem, as well as engaging through various Pan-African networks with the IF and project management institutes. As we reflect on the state of Africa's space industry and manufacturing capability, we must begin with one fact that Africa has built its space journey largely on policy and international collaboration, and we highlight the great national efforts on developing space capabilities. So Africa today has operational capability in satellite operation, ground segment, remote sensing, telecommunication, and data services. However, when we look at space industry, so capabilities remain scattered, and our ecosystem is still fragmented. So it's vital to look now at how national efforts can serve as a foundation for continental scaling. And what we need is an African space industry map to pool and match capabilities across borders rather than duplicating efforts nationally. And we must go or move together from national silos to continental supply chains and shared value. I look forward to discuss this and think Africanly to promote the local space industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. So today's session is going to be moderated by Mr. Thando Mathe with a space policy engager and also a researcher at the Global Development Institute, where he's doing research on the development, economics and climate change. Mr. Thando is also a co-founder of the RIIS consulting company here in Zimbabwe. So over to you, Mr. Thando. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I think everyone can hear me. I'm happy to be here with all of you. I'm happy to be moderating. Everyone who knows me in the space sector knows that I love to have conversations that are centered on the development of the African space sector. So I look forward to an engaging conversation. I think what we're going to do now, my first task of moderating is to give each of the panelists 3 minutes to discuss the industry trends that they're seeing according to their line of work. So I'm going to give each of you 3 minutes to do that, and I will start with Yanko, and then we'll go to Mustafa, and then to Salah. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. I think what's interesting is that we're all probably going to be sharing from the same hymn book, because we're all in the same choir, which is the Space Development in Africa hymn book. So at any point, let's keep me correct if from what I'm seeing in terms of our trends, but we're noticing that there's a large capacity and there's a large growth that's happening in Africa. I think that some of the things we've seen recently is the rise of smaller space programs. Some of them aren't necessarily actual programs, but they're coming through different like ministries at the smaller offices in different countries. I know Zambia's been kicking off, Tanzania's kicking off, Malawi before her excellency, who's now at the Africa Space Agency, we're also starting a program and looking at starting a program as well. But also when we were hosted at the Conference of Space in Africa in Egypt, we're also able to meet colleagues from Somalia, also starting a program. So we can already see that there's a lot of interest in terms of national programs and growth in national programs. I think one of the things that, especially when dealing with Africa and dealing with emerging economies when it comes to space, is that we cannot ignore the EO sector and just how much the EO sector continues to grow and how much the EO sector impacts a lot of the work that's still happening in the downstream for Africa as well, right? And some of the work that we've been doing as well, specifically looks at engaging entrepreneurs and startups and even people who are still ideating in the EO sector as well through a challenge. But also beyond that, we're looking at space economies and space programs that are looking to be competitive on a global stage. Last week I had the privilege of being in Angola, where they were inaugurating their geodata center, which is high-end technology, and also looking at what EXA has done as well with the facilities that they have. I think Africa is not only looking at how best to develop facilities for themselves, but also for the continent, but also for potentially global markets as well, especially even when you think about how Starlink also started launching out of South Africa as well. We have a pulling and the leverage in the ecosystem. I mean, in the space sector in the world, that if it's leveraged quite well, I think that even just the human capital idea of the youth bulge in Africa could be very well utilized for space and the space economy. But that's me. I'm gonna let Mustafa take over from where my harmony ends and continue with his melody for the next from their end.
Thank you very much. Sometimes it's not a good thing to speak after someone like Yanko, right? But I'll try. So for many African countries, right, we've moved from a place where countries are having to do a lot of work in trying to synergize why they need to spend so much on space, and also looking at the potential benefit that they could get from it. In the past, the model was to look for countries outside of Africa and say, oh, these guys are doing this, and then so you can also do a model around what other guys are doing outside of Africa. But right now the trend is different. We have a lot of countries that are doing like wonderfully well in different niche areas in the ecosystem, right? Like Yanko mentioned, we have EXA with their incredible space city and a lot of infrastructures that they've put in place. We have South Africa that are dominating the satellite component manufacturing ecosystem. So it's very clear now. Governments and people that are trying to start up like space programs, they'll have to do a whole lot of talk. They just have to pinpoint a couple of countries in Africa now. So this is better in Africa that are doing wonderfully well with their program, and then they can go to their government to to say this is like a use case or like proof of a proof to show that this works in Africa. And so this trend is linked to now countries like spending more and more on their space program. And right now we have 20 odd countries with like actual space programs. And the last one is Cote d'Ivoire. They launched their space program earlier this month. So the point now is like countries are now like putting a whole lot of money into their space program, to develop critical infrastructures, from like small satellites, which is like the entry point for like many countries, from small satellites to astronomy infrastructures, radio and optical telescopes, to ground segment infrastructures and all other kind of infrastructures. So we are also seeing some PPP partnerships, public-private partnerships. So you have a couple of countries that are looking to work on spaceport development. Yanko mentioned Somalia. So Somalia is doing something with Turkey to build a spaceport. Same thing with Djibouti and the Chinese also trying to build a spaceport. So we are seeing like a whole lot of trends that are coming that are happening right now in the industry, and it's just set the stage for a much aligned ecosystem where different parties, where different players coming together, from Africa, outside of Africa, coming together to play their role and ensure that the industry lives to its potential. Thank you. Salah.
Thank you, Mustafa and Yanko, and you covered almost everything. So I would not like to repeat. I will just add to that there is really a new era of space technology and globally, and I think it's impacted positively Africa as it gives us an easy access to space technology and space assets, and it offers now a more cooperation framework and networking. And I think it has a positive impact on the African ecosystem. So now we are seeing more African involved in space technology and the space forum, in space initiatives, and this thing, I think it's we should highlight this. The second point is that the discussion in Africa start to shift from national needs only, and we now talk about a shared African vision, a shared African policy, strategy, framework, and it was missing this during at least last decade, this let's say continental level of thinking, and it's very impactful, and the inauguration of the African Space Agency is a concrete response to this concern. Another point is that our greatest asset is our youth in Africa, a generation that is digitally native and highly connected, and this new space and new trends offer our generation of young engineers and entrepreneurs to rise and enter to the space club, and it's great. Now we can say that we are thinking to a complete ecosystem composed by all the players, either government, private, and academia, and entrepreneurs, and with the effort of all this player, I think the African
I think we have a break there from Salah. Let's just give him 1 minute and see if he comes back.
Me?
Salah, yes, we have you back.
Okay. So I just the last point I was talking about youth, that our greatest asset in Africa is youth, and we are seeing a generation of young engineer and entrepreneur rising in Africa, and benefit could help to develop ecosystem players with government and private sector and academia to push the ecosystem forward and have a more sustained Thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Salah. I like your emphasis on youth. It's something that I'm always happy to hear people talking about. So we're going to come back to that later. And thank you so much, Mustafa, for highlighting the Cote d'Ivoire case study, which is something that is very interesting because they also recently signed a PPP with a startup, and I think we're also going to talk about that later because I think it's a very interesting case of industrialization. And thank you so much, Yanko, for highlighting the small labs and small departments within governments that are not space programs. In addition to what you've mentioned, I think Botswana also did well with their satellite earlier this year. I think we're going to have to talk about that as well later. Let me take Yanko and Salah for this one, for my first question. I think the both of you have transitioned in an interesting manner in your career. Salah, you came from an engineering background for like 15 years or so, and then you transitioned into consulting, which is something that I aspire to do as well. So I'm very happy about that. And Yanko, you came from a political science, social science, international relations background, and then you transitioned into global corporate management. And now you focus your career on business sourcing, business development, research, and so forth. And if we relate that to the African space ecosystem, I was reading a recent report. It was a presentation on the lessons learned on building the Africa Outer Space Program. And one of the recommendations there, or one of the observations in that report, clearly stated that no African program currently exists without government support. Now, I'm not sure if this is unique to Africa, which I'm sure it is not, but then it would be interesting for the both of you to give me your perspective on the trends that you're seeing in moving away from government support. How do you see private capital moving into the space sector, as we're witnessing in the US, in UK, in Canada, Australia, even the Saudis as well? How is private capital moving in to support the space sector? I think, Yanko, you can answer that first in maybe 1 or 2 minutes, and then while Salah takes a break, and then you can take it up from me. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, great. I think that's a very interesting question, right? Especially when you look at geopolitical trends as well, right? I think that it's very interesting to see the impact of just when you look at it geopolitically, how space is going in Africa. Because we were in Morocco in January for the Africa Middle East Space Conference, the first of its kind, and it was interesting to see the players that were involved and the players that came for that, because it's showing that Morocco is also looking to be interested, right? And there's a lot of private companies that are also involved in that process, and also looking at what's happening in Egypt and what they're developing out of Egypt. The attraction of more international players is also something that's gonna grow. But we also need to take into consideration the fact that last year alone, Kenya had the highest amount of VC funding in Africa, right? So which means there's already money flowing into Africa. There's already potential for a lot of venture capitalist funding coming in. But then what we also need to think about beyond the venture capitalist funding is looking at space-specific funding coming into Africa. Because just because we know that there's a lot of venture capital coming into Africa, we need to figure out how much of that is going specifically into space. So looking at specific space sector funds, there's an organization called I've forgotten, but they're out of the UK. I've forgotten their name. But they're a specific space sector fund, right? I'll put the link in the chat when I remember the name. But so we had a conversation with them, and we were trying to understand how come they're not funding more African space startups, and how come they're not funding more? And they were like, the idea is that there needs to be a stronger pipeline of developed companies in the space sector, but they're willing to bring the funding. It's not like the funding doesn't exist. Even if I think of the country I'm in, South Africa, out of the Western Cape, there's a lot of funding going into the space sector there from the private sector, right? So I think that especially now as it stands, there's a lot of attraction, especially when you look at the upside based on the gaps in Africa, right? Space in Africa in other applications is still very nascent and it's in a developing stage, right? So when that picks up and when that gains traction, the upside of that is crazy. So it already makes sense that private sector and private capital are looking at how to get more involved in the African space sector in terms of funding and ensuring that there's continued work happening in the space sector. But that's what we're finding, is that the funding is there, but it's in pockets, right? Because in Cape Town, it's a lot in terms of manufacturing. Then we're trying to figure out how we can get that funding as well to come to startups. So that's some of the things that we do as well, where we run the African Earth Preservation Challenge as well, where there's funding that supports the winners and to ensure that they can continue with their processes. So because of that, the funding is available, and we just need to be able to build the companies and build the pipelines that can attract larger funding, so that when the funding is coming in specifically for space, it's meeting companies that are ready to uptake and also give a return on investment. Because once we guarantee a return on investment, there's no reason why we can't have increased funding in the space sector in Africa.
Thank you very much for that. I'm happy you have already mentioned the Africa Earth Observation Challenge, because it's an interesting case that we're going to use as an example in a few minutes. But for now, I'm going to give Salah an opportunity of 2 minutes to answer the same question.
Thank you, Thando and Janko, for your insight. So, across Africa, space development remains heavily state-led. While this is expected for such capital investment sector, we are now seeing early signs of private capital mobilization and remarkable events such as the New Space Conference and the recent AMSEC in Morocco and MAS in Cote d'Ivoire. As you know, in a space journey, the starting point is usually launched by the government institution, and as it requires regulation, big investment, developing human capitals, and long-term strategies. But at a given point in this journey, we need to introduce more players to develop the ecosystem. And these players are private sector, entrepreneurs, academia, and the wide users circle. For private business market, profitability and guarantees are key elements, and this could not happen without the support of public institution, in my point of view. So at this level, the public-private cooperation is vital to expand the ecosystem and incorporate the private sector. So to attract the private capital, we need to de-risk early stage, if it's correct to say, to de-risk the early stage ventures. So this means public R&D funding, procurement opportunities, and visibility at international platforms. So the challenge isn't investor interest only, it's more structure. So a pan-African public-private support framework could accelerate this shift, and this could be one of the roles of the African Space Agency. So we need regional funding instrument and procurement pipeline, as Janko said. In this context, governments, but also as a first customers for this private sector.
Thank you very much. I really loved your balance on why space at the beginning is state-led, and then later on it can become self-sufficient. And I think that will lead us into what I want Mustafa to discuss based on what you guys have said so far. But before I go on, I see we have a very large audience today. There's almost 20 of us in the room, and I think we have 15 participants. And 15 participants is a big number, because that's half a classroom. So well done. And if any of you guys have questions, follow-up questions based on the discussion so far, please type them out in the chat. And just to highlight that the fund that Janko was talking about is called Seraphim Space, that has been replied to in the chat. So on that same conversation to do with private capacity building, I want to turn to you, Mustafa. I mean, working at Space in Africa, you have exposure to a lot of data as well, which is why I'm glad to have you on this panel. And so I was reading an article there just after the launch of Africa Space, which is a program being run by the EU Global Gateway Program. In total, it is $150 billion for cooperation between the EU and Africa, and about 100 million euros of that is dedicated to the space sector. And Space in Africa asked the ambassador to the EU ambassador to the African Union, they asked him a very interesting question. So they said, we've done all these programs with the EU, we've cooperated for a number of years. What then is going to happen when the EU stops cooperating with Africa? What does self-sufficiency look like? And just to put it into perspective, you have programs like GMS and Africa, which have been running for, it's almost 25 years now. I mean, it's been changing names from Puma, ArtSec, or something, MESA, and then now it's the GMS and Africa. And it has a footprint in over 45 countries. And you also have a lot of countries cooperating with China and Russia. And I think more than half of the countries that are in the space sector in Africa right now have some sort of agreement with China. Now, Mustafa, I want to understand, from these cooperations, have you seen any of them lead into industrial capacity development on the continent? And what do you see that happening perhaps in the next maybe 5 to 10 years or something?
The question sounds more like thesis, like, it's very lengthy, but I'll
Yes.
I'll try my best. Let me flip it a little bit, right? So let me talk about like one critical thing that you mentioned about self-sufficiency, right? If the funding runs dry from them, what happens to those programs? I think we already have that question from the USAID thingy with US, and then, the stoppage of that funding coming to different programs. So we already have that question already from the US side. So it's just very, it's very straightforward to also have that kind of question for the EU guys, just to see what they also think that would look like. So now to answer your question, the short version is yes. So the international collaborations are beginning to translate into tangible results in terms of industrial capacity development. But I'm going to like break it down into like two different sides. So you mentioned countries partnering with like China and other guys in Europe and every other place on different projects. Then you also mentioned the one about EU. So the first one about countries partnering with China and all of that. The cooperation between Africa and international partners are, like I mentioned earlier, they are beginning to bring about or bring forth, actual benefits that you can pinpoint. So there are examples that I've mentioned, so for the sake of time. So you can look at satellite manufacturing and that particular ecosystem. You can look at in-orbit servicing. You can look at ground station development. You can look at operationalization of ground segments. You can also look at astronomy infrastructures development and also operationalization of that. And you can look at other major facilities. I mentioned spaceports in the earlier scene. So that are examples. But if you want to go like a little bit deeper into one of them, so let me pick like satellite development, for instance. Africans have launched like 65 satellites to date, right? And it's not shocking, but then 41 of those satellites were launched with international partners. So if you now look at it, you would see that majority of them were launched in partnership with guys in Europe. Like 29 of those satellites actually were launched with help from European guys, where France is like a lead in that particular segment. But now the question is, how exactly does this relate to actual capacity building? So when these guys, when countries usually, when they want to go into satellite development, especially for mid to like large size satellites, they are not just buying off the satellites from them. So what they do most times is that they include capacity development components embedded directly in these deals. So you have the contract, but then they're not just acquiring the satellite just for acquiring it. They're also building capacity. So this ensures that African engineers from these host countries, they can also participate in the satellite development stages, from even mission definition to MAIT and to launching eventually. And even after launching, there are also like post-launch operations that they carry out together with the guys that actually build the satellite for them. Then apart from that, there's also on the issue of acquiring data from it and even turning the data to actual intelligence. They also do this in part with the guys that built the satellite for them. So again, to answer that question, yes, we are seeing a lot that is coming from that angle, where the partnership with all of these countries to build satellites have led some countries to actually develop their own satellite. So you have South Africa, Yanko can back me up on this. They've locally manufactured a whole lot of satellites, dating back from Sunsat in the 1990s, down to the ones that did the 2 mini satellites that they launched in 2022 or 2023 or thereabout. So if you now pick the second part, which is like on the EU side, the EU and Africa has had like a very lengthy collaboration. It does not just stop in space, like pretty much everywhere. But if you look at it critically, you would realize that for most part, the partnership has been on the Copernicus Sentinel program for the EU application, and also on Galileo for GNSS application. So like you already mentioned, GMS and Africa has changed name many times. It was MESA at some point, it was Puma, it was AMEST at some point, a lot of names. But the critical thing to highlight here is the continuity, right? And one of the things that you mentioned is continuity. So there's been continuity from when it started from, I think it was Puma at first or whatever. Then it turned to MESA and the other ones before it now got to GMS and Africa, which is in the second phase. So there's been continuity in the project. And there's also been something that they added to it, which is like the adaptive methodologies, to ensure that each program actually delivers on what exactly it needs to deliver. And away from this one, there are also other projects by ESA, and it's also usually around the same line of EU for sustainable development, EU for different thematic application. And also you mentioned the 100 million funding that was brought into from the new project that is called the African EU Space Partnership Program. And the critical thing again to note here that leads to the question is, two main things that they said the funding will be used for is strengthening institutional ties with African and European companies, and also to boost private sector participation. So these are some things that I can say about that. But if we now look at like what would happen like in the next couple of years from this trend that have been happening, we already mentioned like the manufacturing models from like Egypt with the Egyptian Space City. And they have, they have the facility now to do MAIT on satellite up to like 600 kilograms. So that is like a great fit for them. They can collaborate with other African countries. They can collaborate with other private sector players. There's also like regional specialization networks. Like no country can do all the space ecosystem alone. And the best way to do it is to actually pinpoint a particular niche out of like the entire cake and focus on it, get better at it, and eventually get solutions and products that you can sell to the market. So we can see right now South Africa has that. They are the king of satellite component manufacturing. You can pretty much buy every subsystem that you need to build a small to like mid-sized satellite in South Africa. So that is something that we also need to replicate in other countries. You don't have to do everything. Just pick a particular part of the pie and get very good at it, and you can build from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mustafa. I was very tempted to cut you off, but then you were discussing very important points, and I feel like everyone had to hear them. So it's unfortunate that we're running a bit behind time. So I'm just going to encourage all our panelists to sort of shorten their responses maybe to 1 minute, 1.5 minutes. I loved how you spoke about the cooperation between EU and Africa, in as much as it comes from a political sense, it also has divested into many things like those adaptive methodologies that you've been speaking, and also your conversation on specializing in a particular subsector of the whole space value chain. I think that is something valid, and we're beginning to see some of it with our startups. If we take it back to RIIS Yanko, you see, with the Africa Earth Observation Challenge, Nigeria is also pushing an accelerator with their space agency. And I noticed that Rwanda, South Africa, I forgot the other country, they've also been involved in this startup challenge with the UK Innovate. And most recently, the Saudis opened up a startup competition called Space Up. So all this is to try and build specialization through startups. And in Africa, like you said, Mustafa, South Africa has actually been like a breeding ground, and that is just beautiful to watch. And then my question goes to Yanko. We have a lot of success stories in South Africa, like Cube Space. They make altitude determination and control systems. We have Simera Sense. And so outside of South Africa, Yanko, what does the landscape look like, especially with startups and small companies? What does the landscape look like in terms of development of hardware components or other components within the space sector value chain?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a good question. Thank you so much for that.
Yes.
I think
Sorry.
yes.
Sorry to interrupt you just before
No
you
worries.
go. I'm going to give you 1 minute, 30 seconds.
Okay, I'll try. I think it's great also that Mustafa had already kind of created this foundation for me to kind of build on, right? By just kind of underscoring how much South Africa has been a leader in this particular space when it comes to components and all these components happening in Africa, and how he said we need to be looking at other countries doing the same, right? And developing the capacity for doing the same in other countries of Africa. I think what's also interesting, so to flip the question around a bit, is yes, it's great to figure out other companies that are doing some of these things. I think in Kenya we've interacted with a company called Locate IT. They operate in the space as well. I think in Cameroon we've heard of a company, and we've kind of done some research on a company called Eureka Geo as well. And there's some different companies. We've also done some business cases for developing SEZs that will special economic zones that will house manufacturing in Africa specifically, right? We've done some business cases on that as well to kind of increase the participation of government, but also locals in the space sector in other countries as well. But where I think it's also very interesting to think about this and to flip it around a bit is there a market for this in Africa, right? Because what you find to a large extent, a lot of the stuff coming out of South Africa is going out of Africa, right? Now, are we all, so if even if we've got more companies that are doing this in Africa, which I think it will grow in the foreseeable future personally, right? And this is me speaking as Yanko and not RIIS, taking my hat off for a little bit. I think the next 5 years it will grow. But when I put my hat back on, I think that we also need to look at what the ecosystem looks like and how to build that ecosystem. Because yes, if we're all competing for the same market, then we've got so many African companies that will then be developing to build to sell to the same people. So there might be some price gouging and stuff like that, right? So I think that South Africa is going to continue to lead if we do it like that. Whereas if we start to build the expertise to build these things in Africa, so when you look at the fact that there's a lot of movement towards manufacturing stuff in Africa and the facilities in Africa to manufacture, Egypt leading the way, and in Djibouti as well with spaceports, also out of Morocco having a proposal on that, but also Kenya. This will start forcing the market to also start thinking of putting these components together in Africa and looking at different places to get those components as well. So I can see a projection that this will potentially grow, whereas now it's very
given that in the US, for example, Cape Canaveral is nearing its capacity. Does Africa then have a market for that, for launch services only? Briefly.
Okay, so now geography gives Africa a natural competitive edge, and we have prime launch condition. But launch capability isn't just about location, so it's also about supply chain, profitability, safety, and political assistance. A marketable African launch service will require coordinated investment and technical maturity and policy framework. We have seen over 50 to 60 African satellites launched in the last decades. And this number for me, it is under the in a launch industry. As an African, Africa doesn't need 10 or 20 launch sites. The African Space Agency and supported by joint investment and international support, and serving both for a future African.
Okay, so I think we had just a bit of a connection problem with Salah, but I understand that the key point was geography alone doesn't give Africa the advantage. There's so many things that go into launch services. And I think one of those things is capacity, especially in terms of skill. And Yanko, you also touched on this, on specialized skill. But my question now has to go to Mustafa, because like I said, Mustafa, I'm happy that you work with data all the time. I understand now you're a business analyst at Space in Africa, but your background is in mining engineering, which is very fascinating. So the Space Skills and Alliance, for example, it identifies skills gaps in the UK space sector, and they recommend, things like pathways, competency frameworks, and so forth to plug the skills gap. But in Africa, I haven't seen us do a skills audit in the African space sector. And so a lot of speculation, a lot of people in the industry are always saying Africa lacks capacity. Some of it is speculation, some of it is reality, because some people are speaking from experience. But then we don't have the data to back this up. But then, Mustafa, you're closest to this data, whether it exists or not. What is your assessment of skills readiness? So the question is, what is your assessment of the skills readiness for this whole industrialization that we're talking about beyond just launching satellites? And I'm going to give you the shortest time to answer this question, just over a minute. Let's go, Mustafa.
All right. So does the data exist? I would like to say yes. So back in 2021, before the African Space Agency became African Space Agency, the AU, they wanted to do like a baseline study just to understand the ecosystem. Space in Africa did that for the African Union Commission. So a part of the work was trying to figure out what is where. They're trying to pinpoint, the skills, the infrastructures, and all of that. So in a way, I would like to say yes, the data do exist. So what is skill readiness? I would like to say, it's not just space. When you look at like other high technical industries, it's like the same in Africa. One of the key challenges is like the mismatch in skills. So the current professional and industrial training initiative provide like hundreds of technicians when the industry needs like thousands. So there's like a mismatch there already. So even if you do have them, the mismatch is there. There's also like the issue of geographic boundaries, like limiting people. An example is just what you've mentioned like a couple of times now. If you're looking for like satellite component manufacturing, for example, you have to go to South Africa. Even though a couple of other organizations are doing it in some countries, but it's like bits and pieces. But if you want the entire thing, you go to South Africa. If you're looking for like startups in EU, then you can do Kenya. You can do a couple of other countries. You can do Kenya, obviously. So the point is, it's fragmented. That's the point. But if you are looking at it on a continental scale, then we have to do a whole lot to ensure that, you know, these fragments that we have in some regions, in some countries, so we can bring all of that together to build like a truly continental ecosystem. Am I out of time? Should I stop talking, or can I keep going?
I'm going to give you a few seconds.
Okay, so if you look at the academic side, right? Again, you have to go to South Africa. I'm sorry, I'm not South African, I'm Nigerian, but you know, the fact, right? So if you pick the academic side again, you have to go to South Africa because they have the majority of the schools that are doing graduate and, you know, postgraduates that are legit schools. I don't know if I can use that one, but I'm just going to use it regardless. So you have to go to South Africa for majority of those things. So the fragmentation is like the majority, the key issue that we have, apart from the mismatch. So everything that like directly links to each other, where you want something done, but you can only find them in like a particular place. But how can you do it in their own country? Simple. You go by the book that these other countries have used. But it's not as simple as just saying it. It needs a lot of government backing. So the question is the government actually ready to do something about it? And it's not just space, like I mentioned. What we're looking like, the skill gap is not just in space. The reason why we're talking about space is because it's also very, very niche part of like high technical industry. So now another issue, like the last thing I'm going to talk about is, even if you have people that are able to do like to jump to the orders of academic studies, there's just not enough. There's just so little that the agencies can do. I'm talking about the national space agencies. How many people can they take in a year from all these institutions that the institutions are churning out? If you also look at these companies that are also in all of those countries, how many of those people can they really take in, even if they are able to like complete their educations and all? So we have to do a whole lot just to ensure like we bring up all the bits and pieces from everywhere, and we repurpose the models that have worked in other places to different other regions in Africa.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I think you have comprehensively answered this question. But then it always goes back to that question of, do you build it and they come, or you wait for them to come, then you build it, which is something that Yanko touched on when he was talking about the market. What do you think? Sorry, I didn't get that.
No, I said it's like the egg and chicken kind of situation. Like which
exactly.
You do this and you wait for this one to do. Yeah, it's it's very complex, yeah.
It's a very complicated, but I think on our next conversation we would like to break it down into segments. Which skills do we have for which segment of space? But before we go on, there's a question here in the chat, and I would like Sala to answer it. So the question says, how would you classify the niche in the African space industry? Like, what are we good at? What is our specialty? That question goes to Sala, but I would like you to answer it after Yanko has answered this question, because he has already alluded to it. Yanko, if you can hear me, because Alan in the group, on the group chat, has texted, has written his question down, and he speaks of the Akon Equity Bank, which in 2009 was actually part of sort of the foundation of funding the space business sector in South Africa. So he's asking then, given that it has happened before, why are we not developing regional space grant consortiums that can build larger funding pools? And I think, Yanko, you are the right expert to answer this because of your experience in research and development, in business forecasting, and as well as with Africa Space Challenge and RIIS. So just briefly, because you've already touched on it, do you think it's possible for us to develop regional space granting consortia?
Absolutely. I think that it's absolutely possible. I think that there's been some of the conversations we've also had, especially when you're looking at funding, right? You're speaking to, especially when you speak to, say for example, you speak to a VC, right? You have to always guarantee, and I think Salah also mentioned this, there has to be a return on investment. There has to be. When you're talking to private sector, they're always going to think about what do we get out of it, right? And we always have to take that into consideration. However, the reason why regional setups could work is because it means it's a larger pipeline. So a larger pipeline of businesses could mean some sort of guarantees regarding where exactly the funding could land and potential returns on investments based on the countries that are there. I think that this would. I think I might be jumping ahead of myself, but I think it's something that we need to think about in terms of when we're also looking at funding on the development in general, right? Does it help to only fund one country or across countries, right? Now, like Mustafa just said, in a niche sector like ours, where we're speaking about really, really niche things, is there enough of businesses that can take up funding in one country? So yes, I think that the idea is to design funding mechanisms with banks, with VCs that look at regional kind of setups and structures and not just the countries. I think this would be something that's possible, but something that will require a lot of thinking through and then also developing of a pipeline to ensure that there's a backed up thesis behind the funding and where it's going to land.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I think you really showcased your experience in this sector, because you're using a lot of the terms that VCs also want to hear. and I was happy that Salah also was using, terms like de-risking the pipeline itself. So coming back to you, Salah, what do you think about the question from Dawn? The question is about the niche that exists in the African space industry. Do we have any niche at all? If we have niches, what are the opportunities there? Data scientists, data analysts, software engineers, cybersecurity. Do we have any niches in the African space market?
Mhm. From my experience, I think that we could not see the space industry as an independent industry. We have several countries in Africa. They have a well-developed industry in oil and gas, in energy, automotive, software, electronics, mechanical manufacturing, and I think that space industry should rely on this existing developed industry, and we try to with the existing industry to either create a space branch for this industry or just to scale up this industry by pushing them to be space, let's say, space specific, or pushing the quality to reach the required space level. But to create a specific industry only for space, I think it's, as I said, the challenge is the profitability and the return on investment. If you ask an industry to be specific to space, you say, okay, how many parts do you need by year? You say 5. You say, oh, it's not possible to invest only to buy 5 parts, for example. So we need to rely on the existing industry, from my point of view, and try to create some branch from this industry that is space specific.
Thank you so much, Salah. I can see that you're speaking from your very important experience with the IAF Access Committee, because you really touched on how do you balance then being sort of a new entry, an emerging player, but at the same time you want to capitalize on your investment without locking yourself in. And I think what you said ties back into what Mustafa was saying, that when you're considering specialization in the space sector, it's not just that you're a specialist, but it's that you are already in a high-tech industry, and then you are in a high-tech industry inside another high-tech industry, which is now the space sector. And then Mustafa, if I can go back to you, this will be my last question to you. I have Maya from the Egyptian Space Agency asking if we can create a repository, a data repository for the various capabilities of each African space country or companies in the African space sector? Can we create a repository for that, and we use that to our advantage when we're negotiating these cooperation relationships? I believe from a Space in Africa perspective, you have experience with data hubs, and I think you're the right person to answer this.
Thank you very much. Is it possible? Yes, but if you're familiar with Africa, and I mean Africa in its entirety, we have an issue with data. Representation. I mean, it's a lot, and trying to. I'm being real here, right? And also trying to like talk to people to get data on things that they have is like very, very challenging, especially as you move from region to like other regions, right? So, but is it possible? Yes. But that kind of work, right, would have to be sponsored by someone. And I could not think of a better person to do that. I'm serious. I could not think of a better person that would actually need that kind of repository than like the African Space Agency. Like I mentioned, when we did the baseline studies for them, we also helped them create like a data portal. But it is not exactly what she mentioned. So it's pretty much like what exactly is happening. Then it was okay, how many space agencies, how many universities that offers like space related programs, satellite projects, other infrastructures and all of that. But if you're looking for something like this, then it is very possible. And I also, she mentioned something about also knowing where to, if you're looking to buy something like maybe like satellite components, so you know where to go to. If you listen, if you heard when Yanko was mentioning about the fact that although we develop like satellite components in Africa, in South Africa rather, majority of them, like 97% of them goes outside of Africa. So there's also the issue of, the market not yet ripe enough to absorb all that is coming out right now. So, and again, there's also an underlying issue, political, I don't know, where Africans don't really patronize each other, at least for right now. Because when countries are working on satellite projects, for example, they give the contract out to a satellite prime. And once you give the satellite out to a satellite prime, you don't have any say. You have little to no say in who works on the project. Little to no say, like I mentioned. So in some places you might be able to say, oh, okay, I want this person to work on it. But then if you've given the satellite out to a contractor, they would be able to list out everything you need, where you get it from and all of that from you. So even if you know that a contractor is in Africa that builds this, the contract might probably prohibit you from actually using them. So there are like a lot of issues, like a whole lot of them, that you need to unpack before you can understand Africa. It's
yeah, that's very true. Thank you, Mustafa. I mean, it's funny that you mentioned this, because this has always been sort of a challenge which is hidden, a challenge which you know only until you sort of analyze the policies governing the space sector. And speaking of policies, well, this is what I hate about webinars. You always run out of time when the conversation is just getting juicy. So it's unfortunate that we're already 10 minutes over time. So I'm just going to use maybe just 5 extra minutes just to give each of our panelists an opportunity to just mention one thing. If there's one thing, a policy, an initiative, a program that you could change or implement in the African space sector, what would that thing be? And with that, that will be my outro, and I will hand over to Muongeni. So each of our panelists, just one thing, and we say goodbye. Thank you very much. Oh, apologies. We'll again start with Yanko, go to Salah, and then go to Mustafa.
Cool. I didn't want to assume that I was going to start again, Thando. So thank you so much for that.
That's
fine. Look, I think for me, policy is just. I think it's still early days for government to step back from developing the ecosystems. But I also think it's time that we that the entrepreneurs and startups start to build the ecosystems themselves, right? So for me, I think the policy change that I encourage is to allow for government to create policy and enable policy that's going to allow startups and entrepreneurs to develop the space sectors for themselves in their countries, for their region and their continent. So as opposed to saying you can't do this, if someone says, but I'm thinking of doing A, B, C, D, government working with that entrepreneur or that startup to figure out how best to enable them to continue that work, as opposed to just regulating and things of the sort. So that would be my policy change, Mustafa.
So I think I would like to suggest like an investment and talent mobility framework. So it fits into like what we've been talking about, the skill gap and all of that, and also like the segregation or fragmentation of the skills in different regions of the continent. So with this kind of like mobility framework, it's going to address scaling, where you have to pull resources from like all the 54 individual countries. It also solves like the skill distribution issue by allowing expertise, like they can generally just flow to where the opportunities are. And, it also creates like from the VC aspect of things, it also creates like a market confidence. So investors see the continent as like a larger pie rather than, 54 individual fragmented entities. Salah, you can take us out.
Okay, thank you, Mustafa. I'm thinking to push to intra-African relationship. So as we notice, we have a lack in the bilateral African relationship. I mean, in concrete projects. And I would like to introduce a policy or recommendation in this sense. So it would be a Pan-African Space Innovation Fund dedicated to co-financing startups and industrial projects, and governing by the African Space Agency, with the condition to be an intra-African organization, and the second condition is to demonstrate the shared ownership of the product and service between several African countries. So that's why we can push African to work together and create value together.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Salah. I think I'm happy because all of the questions asked by Maya, Dawn, and Alan have all been sort of incorporated, and some of your recommendations are actually touching on those questions, especially on the funding side and the data hub side. So my name has been Thando Mathe, and it was a pleasure moderating this session. I'll hand over back to Muongeni to give us thanks and to exit us. Thank you very much for this discussion. I really enjoyed it. I wish it had gone on for longer. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks, Thando. Thank you very much to our speakers. I wish we had the whole day to discuss this, but unfortunately, time is not on our side, so we have to call it a day. Thank you, Yanko. Thank you, Mustafa and Salah. And thank you, everyone who joined this webinar. I hope we learned quite a lot and was so much interested in the youth side. And I'm grateful that all your insights are going to be useful in terms of changing the space ecosystem. So we meet in another session next time when we organize another SGAC Zimbabwe webinar. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure. It was